Hello and welcome to Approaching Singularity. I'm Dr. Jack Symes. It's a pleasure to be with you for what's set to be a brilliant discussion on a packed panel. I've just had a panel with two people, so this is going from 0 to 100. We often speak of the singularity as a distant rupture, a moment when machines surpass human intelligence. But a more pressing possibility is quieter and more profound. Humans integrating into a superintelligent network, meaning cognition with code. If that future unfolds, the central challenge will not simply be innovation, but cognitive sovereignty, ensuring that individuals retain autonomy, agency, and meaningful selfhood. Who retains human rights in a world of enhanced minds? How do we guarantee informed consent and prevent mind control when thought itself becomes interfaceable? And if intelligence, identity, and community migrate into networks, what becomes of nation states, markets, and power structures? Joining me to discuss these questions, we have, from front to back, Kat Mayfair. Let's go again. Kat Mayfair. 3, Robert Richards. 4, Kate Rosenbluth. 5, Anders Sandberg. 6, Jacob Grabach. And 7, Jared Genster. And on the screen, we have Susan Schneider. Okay. Great. It's a mouthful. It will take us all day to go through all of your many accolades and positions, so forgive me for not doing so. You can name drop them if you need the ego boost. Bob, we were out until silly o'clock in the morning. Your fault, not mine, and you were telling me all about your thoughts on the singularity. So I thought a good place to start, just to bring everyone up to speed, is what the singularity is, and we can springboard off that.
Sure, thank you, and it was my fault for keeping you up so late last night. I'm very sorry, but it was very enjoyable. So contextually, we borrow the idea, the metaphor of the singularity from astrophysics, cosmology, where the idea of a singularity is actually a collapsed star that collapses so deeply that if you're in a singularity, there's no information that can get out because the gravitational strength is so strong. Light can't get out, information can't get out. There's just no way of knowing. There's no possibility of knowledge. Borrowing that idea from astrophysics in the world of the singularity as we're discussing today, the singularity is near, as you may have heard from one of our industry's exemplar philosophers, Ray Kurzweil, is that there's an information and computation singularity coming at us, which is driven by an exponential curve. So it's not so much a singularity of gravity as a fast approaching hockey stick. I'm a Canadian, so it's a hockey stick curve, where that exponential information is becoming asymptotic, where the power of computation and information is growing so fast that at some point, very soon, the sum total of the computation capacity of the human race will be contained in a device that you can hold in your hand. And what is the world or what is the universe like, not just mechanically, but philosophically, when that happens? There's no way for us to know that because that is a circumstance, a reality that's so beyond our possibility of knowing. What is that singularity? That's what we're talking about today, is that singularity moment.
Anders, you want to come in straight in? Yesterday we were on a panel talking about something similar, weren't we? The brain machine interfaces, and you were very pleased with the idea. Is one of the benefits of brain computer interfaces that it's able to translate the information that after the singularity to comprehension to our minds?
I'd like to get to that, but at first I would like to untangle the concept of singularity a bit more, because some people joke that the singularity is like a black hole in thought. No light comes out of it. There is a problem that we actually use the word in several different meanings. There is the original one in physics and mathematics. Then that was used as a metaphor by Vernor Vinge in a very influential essay that coined the concept, the technological singularity. And in his description, he said, we're making technologies that are making us smarter. That allows us to make better technologies, and that means that now we're accelerating and we might be reaching superintelligence in a very short time because it gets faster and faster. And beyond that point, I can't say anything as a futurist or science fiction author. Notice that there are three different things going on at the same time. that opaqueness, but also that feedback loop, making things go faster, and that exponential. That feedback loop of intelligence, the intelligence explosion, was already proposed in the 1960s by I.J. Good, one of the collaborators with Alan Turing, actually. So it's an old idea, but it's a very powerful one. There is plenty of other takes on the singularity to make confusion maximal. But I think what we want to deal with here is that enhancement of intelligence that we're seeing right now from AI, from neural interfaces, from collective cognition. That is leading to a place where stuff is changing very rapidly. And it's making life very hard for futurists and the science fiction authors.
Well, if brain-machine interfaces misfire like some of the mics on, I'm a little bit worried what it might do to my brain. Kate, your thoughts here on whether the singularity is inevitable, and perhaps what that means for us philosophizing, or for us for taking on board this information, whether this sort of interface will be necessary for comprehending the information available to us.
Well, let me start by sort of adding some of the perspective on this. I'm a builder. I'm an engineer and neuroscientist. And so let me sort of speak to this from the lens of people who are really developing these technologies today, carrying them through the various regulatory bodies and launching them for the betterment of patients and of people. Picking up on Andrew's comment about feedback loops, one of the things that I really want to emphasize here is that if we look at today's technology and also where the technology is going, actually writing to the nervous system or putting information into the nervous system is substantially harder than reading from or listening to the nervous system. So let me just walk you through sort of one example, which is a technology I invented to put this in context, and I think help provide some helpful fodder for discussing the interface of technology and the nervous system. So this device that I'm wearing here, this is a prescription therapy. It is commercially available in the United States. It is cleared through the Food and Drug Administration, and it is a treatment for action tremors and essential tremor and Parkinson's disease. So I used to work in the invasive space in deep brain stimulation and technologies where a surgeon would actually drill through the skull, implant electrodes in the brain in order to directly write into the brain in treatments for areas like Parkinson's disease. What we realized and ultimately led me to spin Cala out of Stanford University was that we could leverage a lot of the same science actually in the peripheral nervous system. So in this case, we are measuring characteristics of the nervous system, like patient's tremor, speed, is it fast, is it slow, and then delivering the individually calibrated stimulation, electrical stimulation, to the median and radial nerves that actually inputs the signal back into the peripheral nerves, up into the brain, and interrupts the tremulous firing pattern. So I think that this is a really good example of where you are interfacing and you're having feedback actually into the body. This is highly accelerated by areas like AI. I think as we think about sort of the singularity and the intersection of technologies and of future AI into the nervous system, this is really one of our bigger challenges that I hope gives us both comfort and hope, that it's actually quite hard to write into the nervous system as well as to read from the nervous system and feed that into these information systems.
Jared, from a human rights perspective, your thoughts here, there's a few issues there, right? There's the benefit of helping people, immediately we're thinking people with various disabilities and the like being assisted by devices like this, it improving our health, enabling us to access information otherwise unavailable to us. But then there is issues of privacy, and these technologies being used for ill. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think, on the one hand, 1 in 3 people in the world in their lifetimes will have a neurological disease. And so I think that demonstrates just by itself the importance of developing emerging neurotechnologies that will go a long way to ultimately treating those kinds of brain diseases that people can get. I mean, today we can't cure any brain diseases. Mm-hmm. All we can do is at best slow their progression. And what we're looking at 10, 20, 30 years down the road is ultimately getting to a point where you could stop the progression or even reverse it. That's not an immediate term thing. It's already the case that you can buy on the market today wearable neurotechnologies that are primarily EEG scanning devices. And that those are not science fiction, but science. Everything from like flying a helicopter drone with your thoughts is something that can be done, or determining if you're in a meditative state to try to improve your ability to meditate and so forth. But we're also on the cusp of thought-to-text translation in a wearable device. There's a prototype device out of Australia that can do thought-to-text in the form of words, just to be clear, at around 15, 20 words a minute, 40% accuracy. That's far from where it would need to be to ultimately be generalizable. So we're still several years away from this. But Apple knows what's coming. They've already filed their next generation patent application for AirPods. They're going to have built-in EEG scanners in it. And I think that it's only literally a few years before you're going to be able to send a text message with your thoughts. But when you start talking about accessing a person's thoughts, then obviously there are enormous human rights implications for privacy. But you were mentioning as well, and I fully agree, that we're also talking about mental agency, mental identity. We're talking about non-discrimination and how these devices are developed and then made available publicly, as well as questions of fair access to mental augmentation. So I think these are all coming fast and furious. I'll just lastly conclude by noting that I was in Guatemala just a few weeks ago and for the first time used the new Apple Translate device in two directions, speaking to a person who didn't speak a word of English. I don't speak much Spanish or enough to be dangerous, but not much beyond that. And we were able to have a fluent conversation, not perfect, maybe 80%, back and forth, wearing this device. And that gives you just a very small sense of like what's coming, because, I've never spoken Spanish in my life. And yet here I am speaking English and able to communicate with a person that before this device and this technology was available, I couldn't access. And that's just the tip of the iceberg.
I was going to bring Susan in here, but she's blacked out. Susan, can you still hear us? Yeah. Susan, as a philosopher of artificial intelligence, one thing which I picked up on from hosting a lot of these panels on AI is people's leniency towards speaking about the risks, the benefits, the accepting that the singularity is inevitable and wanting to talk about the implications on our values or existentially. Have you found a similar progression in the conversation in your own work? And what do you think the philosopher can lend to a discussion like this when we move beyond questions fundamentally of philosophy of mind?
We cannot hear her.
Sorry, Susan, we can't hear you just yet. The technology is not there for a Zoom call, let alone the singularity. So I'm not too concerned. Kat, do you want to come in on any of the themes we've picked up on just there?
Yeah, sure. I want to echo what everyone has said. I think the fundamental is to define what is singularity. That needs to be defined because we're at a stage of technology where that needs to be defined, and it's singular to me, and we need to define what it means to be human. That's a very important aspect to this. Why? Because once we define what it means to be human, the next big challenge, the next big problem is, what is consciousness? Now, we haven't even gotten that far yet. We try to with neuroscience, but these are 5 neuroscientific problems for consciousness, whether it's generic consciousness, specific consciousness, the hard problem, axis versus phenomena, or neurocorrelates. We've gotten to the abilities to extract meaning from neurocorrelates, and we've done very well with it. But the problem here is we need to define what consciousness is. We need to understand what it means to be humans to further elaborate on singularity, because singularity is still rather new, I believe, and it is still coming from a source, and that source is generative AI. And if that source is generative AI, where it is populations summarized, pools of data, then we're far away from the individual or the referent that is most important for precision healthcare, medicine, or even education.
Jake.
Sorry, we could have another try.
Or with Susan?
Let's try, yeah.
Susan, I did just ask you a second ago, and I said that philosophers and people don't want to be talking about philosophy of mind, the hard problem, neurocorrelates of consciousness. And then Kat literally said the thing that I said people don't want to talk about. So maybe people do want to talk about it. How important do you think it is to be thinking about the nature of humanity, the questions of the nature of consciousness when we're thinking about these emerging technologies?
I think it's very important. Can you all hear me?
Just about.
Okay, yeah. So consciousness is the felt quality of experience. So when you smell the aroma of a cup of coffee, see a sunrise, it feels like something of the you. Throughout your waking life, and even when you're dreaming, it always feels like something from the inside of you. That's what consciousness means. And I think people tend to be confused about what the core concept of consciousness is, understandably. And that's what it is. And you can see immediately that it has great neural significance, because the quality of your consciousness is what determines the quality of your life. So if we augment our abilities, including our intellectual abilities, we affect the quality of our consciousness, right? And if we require of people that they enhance and they don't want to, that could turn lives and compromise rights, human rights. Similarly, we have to make sure that we have a digital data space that preserves human rights. So, we need to think first and foremost about that. And also bear in mind the limits of these technologies as we develop them. So it may be that we can enhance the periphery of the brain, but we won't be able to put microchips in the important parts of the brain that underlie consciousness, because AI itself is not capable of consciousness. So I think there are a lot of issues here that need to be spelled out as we move forward with this really exciting technology.
Okay, let's bring Jacob in as well. Former director of the Center of Future Generations. How does your work link in with these philosophical themes, human rights and the like?
Yeah, it's a great question. My background's in economics and electrical engineering, so I feel like I don't have much right to talk about issues of the brain. Perhaps as a consumer of some of these technologies, I was in a coma in the spring of 2020 and used a lot of these technologies, or the doctors did, to help me get well. So yeah, for the audience, you can see my track scar here. That is one way I've interfaced with these technologies. But so the reason I was called to this panel was not that, but it was that I was the Foresight director, actually, of the Center for Future Generations before. And Foresight, or future studies, well, looks to the future. It's not quite the same as forecasting. It often deals with things that are a bit more uncertain, a bit more nascent, such as neurotechnologies today can still potentially take many different directions. And one of the tricks in the toolkit of a foresight practitioner is to ask the question of what are the hopes and fears that people have associated with some new concept, right? So what are the hopes and fears that we have related to these neurotechnologies? And I think we're hearing some things here, for instance, related to human rights. I can think about some of my own things. There was some discussion here about the difference between technologies that read from the brain and technologies that write to the brain. And both can be useful, but especially as you start adding this like writing to the brain, that's stuff that can be used for good, right? You can use it to treat medical issues, but you can also use it to improve everyone's experience, even if you don't have a medical issue. Maybe you can be happier or more awake or feeling at your best more of the time. But then you're also giving someone the power to control if you're feeling happier and more awake. Whoever is developing these technologies and either like putting them in your brain or putting them on your brain and body, depending on how invasive such a technology would be. And is that the kind of power that we want anyone else to have over us, really? Like,
yeah,
it could be used for quite authoritarian uses, right?
Yeah, and as you're quite a strong proponent, though, of the opposite. You want to make this technology readily available to all people, presumably. But do you have this worry about writing to the brain and?
Yes, of course. Modifying, for example, motivations is one of the most dangerous technologies ever. So you really need to be really, really careful about it. But when thinking about rights and how to frame it in society, I'm also a very strong proponent of what I call morphological freedom. But we have a right to our own bodies, we have a right to individual freedom. That means also a right to change our bodies. Or to not change our bodies. And one can, of course, move this over to the cognitive domain also to say, I have a right to change my mind. But that right still is circumscribed by a lot of practicalities, because I might not have a proper right, for example, to wreck my mind. There might be limits on how much I might mess things up. But at the same time, when we try to place restrictions on technologies that are dangerous, there is always a risk that because of privacy restriction, we also limit what people can access about their medical implants. Indeed, quite a lot of patients would like to have more access to the medical implants, and they're not allowed to. And companies and quite often governments say, you're not allowed to because of privacy rules. But it's my medical data, it's my body. Yeah, but we have made the rules and you better obey the rules. In this case, it limits something that I think is an important freedom, to know your body. So I think one of the best ways is, of course, to distribute control and make sure it rests in the hands of people. But you still need the right kind of incentives. You need the right kind of consumer information. You need the right kind of oversight to make this work well. And for some technologies, that's going to be much easier than others.
Do you worry, Kat's questions at the beginning about what is a human, what is the nature of consciousness? How relevant are these questions to your mind, Anders?
I think they're less relevant here. I think we might debate it. It's a great philosophical topic, but I don't think it works into practical political practice. However, there is a core there that's actually quite relevant for much of what we're discussing here. Liberal democracy and classical liberalism is very much based on an idea of an atomistic individual. I'm in charge of my life. I can rationally decide what to do and not to do. And of course, modern neuroscience just laughs at this. Haha, look at this brain scan. We can predict what you're going to do seconds before you do it. And actually, you're not one part. You have many parts, and they're not always working together. We're dissolving a bit of a self. And I think we need to reinvent actually quite a lot of our thinking in liberalism, in how we deal with individuals, in the light of neuroscience. And these technologies are going to speed that process, make it much more urgent.
Kate, you're nodding quite enthusiastically there.
Yeah, just to sort of pick up on a couple of these topics. So the reason I sort of raised the question even of reading and writing to the nervous system is, to me, they have a lot of very different implications. And when we talk about areas like improving intelligence, as was mentioned earlier, we are still a ways off from being able to feed back intelligence into the nervous system. Stimulation is very hard. So even if you look today, we still have a really hard time benefiting diseases like Parkinson's disease. Even though the mechanism of Parkinson's is reasonably well understood, we have technologies to interface with the brain. It is really, really hard to treat, these underlying clinical symptoms. Likewise, if you look at a lot of these current technologies, whether we're talking about the thought to text, you look at, control of prosthetics, of a computer mouse, playing games. These are all things that are actually extracting information out of the nervous system and applying that. There is a reason that the input technologies, that the stimulation technologies are highly regulated. And I think a lot of the topics that we're discussing today, for this particular technology as an example, we had to go through publishing studies on over 2,000 patients. That includes, the gold standard clinicals, comparison to sham, comparison to standard of care, different mechanistic publications, really understanding sort of side effects, adverse events. And there is a really important reason for that, as well as for, security and control of the data. So I'm a big believer patients should always have agency. Patients should always be in control of their own therapy. That's why patients have complete control, over this device. And when you look out to some of the other extensions of this, that I do think we need to consider from ethical, giving control, maintaining control with the patients, we need to think about everything from, what happens when the technologies are no longer available? What happens when you have an explant question, for example, the patient who's been implanted from a technology, the company no longer exists? Where is the sort of moral and ethical considerations for that, as well as consent, dynamic consent for technologies that are ongoing, needing living agreements for living devices. So I think there's a lot of really interesting questions there. I just also want to give us comfort. There's a reason that these are the highly regulated parts of the medical device sector.
Kat, your thoughts on Anders's and Kate's remarks there?
Well, we're still at a point where we're defining all, so there's not a right or wrong answer. How I see it pragmatically is singularity is singular, and it's towards a superintelligence. But when we're forced to define what it means to be humans, that's not singular, is it? It's multiplicity. because there's so many dimensions of consciousness of the gentleman sitting in front of me, from you, from everyone else. So when you define that and you find out it's individual versus a generative AI model, then we're far away from what the singularity is. I think there would be a new term, call it the matrix, I don't care. But it is singular. We are multifaceted human beings. So consciousness is very relevant in this topic. Why? Because it defines who you are. And once you define who you are, neurorights is the government of identity. And whoever governs identity governs society.
So I'm struggling a little bit because I was thinking, I didn't know the singularity had to involve consciousness and have its own subjective experience, but maybe this is a misunderstanding on my part, because Susan a moment ago told us over Zoom, she said that, you know, philosophers take consciousness to be qualia, the subjective experience, the smell of coffee, and there's nothing more familiar. Consciousness is the sound you're hearing now, the feeling of your chair underneath you. There's nothing you know more intimately. And so we certainly differ in the contents of our consciousness, but the concept of consciousness, Susan was remarking a moment ago, seems to be well understood, if not better understood than sort of anything in our worlds.
Can answer that. So I did mention about the 5 big problems that neuroscience has on consciousness. These are very important because for decades, for as long as I have studied, philosophers have always tried to define what consciousness is. We've taken the approach of neuroscience, but that doesn't solve it. It's not the solution, is it? It's not a solution of philosophy. It may be a solution of biophysics, hint, hint. It could be a solution of mathematics. But the more important relevance is understanding the individual, because we are not population summaries of data pools. When that happens, we become subjected to singularity, superintelligence that overrides our identity. And we need to maintain our agency before we get lost in translation somehow, because that's the major number 1 problem in precision medicine, healthcare, and so forth.
Susan, do you want to jump in on this point?
Sure, I'd like to kind of respond to
I think we may have lost your audio again, Susan, and we'll try and get you back up and running in just a moment. Bob, my misunderstanding of the singularity.
I'm empathetic with your misunderstanding, because I'm learning from what Kat has said and what Susan has said. It's really opened my eyes to how important it is, or is it, important what we define consciousness, and from Susan what it is. And I was in my model. I'm an engineer by heart, I guess, and training in graduate studies, space science. So I find myself, this is what consciousness is. I can build that, is what I'm thinking. But I was really thinking of consciousness more of a cognitive process, not a biochemical reaction to external sensory input, which is what I heard, if I heard it right, from Susan. It's feelings. And if I heard right, AI, as I think the qualification, Susan can correct me if I'm wrong, was AI as it is not capable of consciousness. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay, so going back to, I think, your point, Kat, we better understand as humans what consciousness is, because that defines not only who we are, but what the boundary condition is between humans and AIs. And if we're worried about our human rights today, where do our human rights begin and end? Where do the AI rights begin and end? And if we can define a consciousness, if there is a consciousness that arises that we agree is a consciousness as an AI, then and if we can replicate what we would interpret as feelings within humans, that AI is actually demonstratively experiencing that as well, then do we have our own moral ethical frameworks to say, well, then we have to recognize that consciousness, that external, as another life form that has rights. So that's where I'm in as an engineer.
Susan, I'm not sure if we've got you back. The distinction between what it is to be human, what it is to be transhuman seems to be important. Do you want to have a go conceptually as the cognitive AI philosopher as to what that concept might look like? Could you flesh it out for us? I think you're still not with us just for a moment. We'll come back to you and try you again in a second. Jared.
Yeah, no, I just want to make an important point on agency, which I think is really at the center of all this, because while we are far from being able to easily write to the brain and to change a brain based on inputs in a lot of ways, the decoding technology, as was mentioned earlier, is very, very good and getting much, much better. And so concerns about privacy from emerging neurotech are not science fiction, they're science. There's literally many dozens of devices you can buy online. My foundation, the Neurorights Foundation, did a study of the user agreements of all of these companies and published it. It was on the front page of the New York Times. And what we found was that in 29 out of the 30 examples that we looked at, basically all of your contents of your brain scan were being sucked up by the companies and were being kept by the companies for indefinite periods of time to use as they see fit. And when you're talking about with an EEG scan, depending on the resolution of the device, from 10, 20 megabytes to 60 to 80 megabytes per hour of data, of which today we can only decode about 1% to 2% of it, and companies keeping that data, it's very difficult to imagine how the informed consent model actually would work, because we don't even know yet entirely what's in there. We do know, and my colleague Rafael Yuste is a famous neurotech expert at Columbia, runs the neurotech lab there. He has said, we're going to be able to ultimately decode our subconscious thoughts, not just our conscious thoughts. So how is it that you can give consent to provide access to a company or to a government when you can't even define exactly what's in the information that you're giving away? And I think that keeping agency at the center of this is going to be, absolutely essential. So I'll just leave it there.
Jacob, you were saying some of the biggest fears people have around this technology, one of them being that it can read our subconscious thoughts. That seems to be high on the list.
Yeah, I do think that is, let's call it a dual use capability, right? Can be used for good, can be used for ill purposes. I wanted to comment on something from Jared here in the last comment you made on us being able to manipulate the preferences of the brain. Because we do have at least two very forceful ways of doing that already. One is having kids and the other is taking heroin. We know both of these can really rewrite human preferences, right? And so we know there's a proof of concept here, and we cannot do it with precision with neurotechnologies yet. But what we know from AI is that the number one thing that helps AI learn is vast amounts of data. So as we wear more and more of these devices, I see several of these rings on this panel, I think, that track more and more. Well, this tracks my bodily functions, not my brain functions, but we're also starting to track more and more of that. That is exactly the juice that the AI needs to learn, right? Then if you kind of extrapolate that trend, that becomes something that could be capable of similar manipulations of our preferences as those two we already have.
You think in political in particular, political control, we've spoken about on a bunch of the panels, big tech using large amounts of data to push people towards voting for certain causes or riling them up by showing them certain things. The more data they have on us, the more they're able to manipulate us. Is that the thought? Is that the worry?
I mean, there's a high precision version of that I think is I haven't seen anything that indicates we're almost there.
Yeah.
And then there's another version of that, which is more similar to how, I have a little dog and how you train the dog is it behaves well and you give it a treat. And it's here's your straight into the brain electronic treat for behaving well. And over time you build associations. And so when the government says sit, you sit, right? So I think there's this softer version of that is more playing to our animalistic wiring in a sense.
Susan, if you can hear us, we are trying to get you back on the line. But Anders, you want to come in on this point?
Yeah, I'd like to flip that point actually. Oh.
That's good. We can hear you. It sounds like you're doing an SOS call, though, from what we hear. Well, help is on its way. But in the meantime, Anders.
Yeah, I'd just like to do a quick flip on that point. It's not just that human preferences are manipulable. It's also very valuable to know human preference if you want to align AI. One of the fundamental problems we have in AI safety is that it's very unclear what people actually truly want. And getting that reliably into AI is actually one of the really deep problems. It's not the only one. And this is, but it's still important. And this might be where neural interfaces might actually be really valuable, because if a robot can check, does Anders want me to kick that little old lady in front of a truck? No, he absolutely abhors it. Okay, let's not do that. It can start copying some of the preferences, especially if it can get the causal reason. Oh, there's something called compassion in Anders' brain that makes him not want that. That is a really important use case. Many people have been proposing, oh, maybe we can enhance ourselves with neural interface so we can outthink theirs. That's not going to work, because software is going to be faster than the squishy stuff up here. If you can't beat them, join them. That's also kind of doubtful. It's not clear that you're going to be on the winning political side of the cyborgs. But getting preferences into computers, it's double-edged. But it is also kind of an important thing to do. We might actually want to be better able to get machines to understand what we want.
Jared, there's some general human preferences from a human rights perspective, though, aren't there, which might be relevant to this conversation. Could you tell us some of the capabilities, approaches are fashionable in philosophy at the moment, general things that all humans want to do by nature, and you could put those principles into AI, surely?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not a philosopher, but I do think that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in Article 1 of it says, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and in rights. And I think that that's sort of the touchstone for the modern human rights movement that we've seen since the advent of the United Nations. And I think that there are, from the Universal Declaration came two treaties widely subscribed in the world: the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And I think that while there are also many other rights that one would want to have, and in fact today there's 10 international human rights treaties, a lot of it comes down to the basics of survival and in terms of what do we need. And once you've taken care of your basic human needs, then you want to have input into your work life, your home life, your family life, et cetera. But I do think that it is going to be increasingly challenging as you look at approaching a singularity to kind of figure out where human rights end and where non-human rights or AI rights from the perspective of the AI may begin. Right now, today, all human rights treaties are limited to human beings. We have yet to come to a place where we believe that there's an AI that approaches a human being in terms of the respect for fundamental rights and freedoms that might be that they might prefer. But that is not as far off as we might imagine.
Susan, hopefully you can hear us and we can hear you, can certainly see you. This question of whether or not, raised by Jared there, AI will be deserving of rights in the future from this perspective of philosophy of minds and AI.
So it depends on whether AI is conscious or not, because if something is not conscious, it's much more further ethically to prove that it requires rights. I would also caution against making a blanket statement about whether AI requires rights, because the more I investigate the AI consciousness space myself, I see that there are important differences in different kinds of AIs, and that's going to impact their capability of being conscious of this place. So AIs that are kind of biologically based, for example, are definitely in a candidate class to potentially having some level of consciousness. And as those grow more and more sophisticated, as they're developed more carefully and with greater scientific understanding, it very well could be that they do require some level of ethical protection because they're conscious. But it may not require the same level of protection that you give a human. Political philosophers often talk about equal concern and respect as being a significant element of the moral calculus. So it may be that AI has a different kind of consciousness and a different kind of requirement on how it be treated, but still requires some level of rights.
Bob, is this a bit of a distraction? We've been non-human animals, for example. Very few people would deny consciousness to all non-human animals, but they enjoy the rights and protections that perhaps that people might generally agree that they're owed. In practice, we simply ignore them. Talking about whether or not we should be giving rights to AI, is it similarly
I'm with you.
misleading?
That's exactly what I was thinking. So, as somebody who kind of spends their conscious life thinking about humanity's future among the stars and being an interstellar species and all of those things that hopefully imply that we've grown up as a species and we can actually do that in a way that doesn't take our warring nature with us. Looking at humanity, we humans tend to be very arrogant and by definition anthropomorphic. And I was thinking about the other life forms on this planet that we claim apex rights over. Animals, some are cute, some are not. But the idea of animal rights is not. It seems similar to me as a digital entity that has some level of consciousness that maybe we will bestow some level of rights on that consciousness. Animals, one of the rights we bestow is the right to humane murder. And so we can stop their life, we think, because we have the right to do that. And I'm just wondering if consciousness and AIs as an entity, as a life form, is a continuum. Where's the philosophical boundary? I'm thinking again as a scientist and engineer, what is the makeup of that boundary? You're saying, Kat is saying this. I'm not sure if other people are rolling their eyes. I can't see in this direction.
Let's go to Anders. Were you rolling your eyes there, Anders?
Probably, but yeah, drawing boundaries is hard. And I was thinking there is the philosophically interesting boundaries, there are the existentially interesting boundaries, and then there are the practical legal boundaries, because deep down it needs to be a question: what kind of society would future humans that are working with AIs and maybe are more or less integrated with technology actually have to have? And that might mean that we're going to draw some lines that are fairly arbitrary. Why do you get to vote when you reach a certain age? Well, most people at that age is mostly mature enough to be able to vote. There are exceptions, but it's so complicated to make these exceptions. So generally, we have found that is a simple solution. When it comes to this, we also have not yet talked about groups, because groups might also, of course, have rights. This is again a debate, the question and topics, but we see it actually here. So we might intuitively say that groups are not people, they don't have experience, they can't have a right. Yet we talk about genocide as a special kind of crime that is kind of attacking a group rather than just killing all the individuals. And we recognize, there is something serious going on here. And these technologies are going to allow us to integrate much more with each other and the systems, which are going to create other compound entities. But I think the solution is probably going to be solved by a lot of lawyers. It's going to be super annoying to us philosophers because we want a clean solution, we want a deep insight, but then there is also the practical thing: who do you sue? And I think that is where we're going to end up with some structure, probably based to a fair degree on existing things, which is going to be chafing in all sorts of uncomfortable ways because it's not entirely fit to it, but then we can hopefully adapt.
Jared, thoughts you on group rights in particular? Just another way of saying groups for rights for lots of people, or a special category in and of itself?
Yeah, again, I think that if you look at consciousness, there's of course a continuum, and there will be the question of where do you draw the line? I mean, one could think theoretically about the right kind of AI and what kind of group rights certain categories of AI might get over time. That's pretty far, kind of distant future, I think. Not too far off, but at the same time, not kind of the immediate concern. I'm a little less concerned about Anders' view of kind of the lawyers taking over, because I can say as a lawyer myself, I wish I could take over certain areas. I'm far from being capable of doing that. But no, more seriously, I think that there is always this regulatory lag that takes place, and we're always trying to play catch up. And that's the case, as I said already, with emerging neurotech and the fact that there really aren't yet enforceable global governance models that, for example, protect neural data in the same way as biometric and genetic data, even though there should be. And so I think we're always going to be one or two steps behind in terms of governance questions.
Kate, this might be a positive thing for your industry, though, right? If the regulation's not keeping up with you, you can quickly progress with the kind of innovations that can help people without being bogged down by the law.
Yeah, I think if you look at timescales in different areas of technology, so if you look all the way from, let's say, something like gene therapy, right, takes 10 to 20 years to bring it to market. You look at implanted devices, those are still on a 5 to 10 year timeline. Even what we're doing in non-invasive stimulation, it's still 10 years from proof of concept to being where we're at today, that it's a therapy that is available on market. And so I think that when you look at these gaps where this especially gets challenging is in areas of software, let alone when you start to look at sort of AI and learning models and systems. And yes, the regulatory agencies are continuing to innovate to build new appropriate structures for basically matching the pace of the types of innovation that they're regulating. So, I would just sort of caution us a little bit in saying, when you look at, to come back to the idea of, consent, which I think is absolutely critical, consent and data privacy, and really importantly, intended use, is we have to be very specific with these technologies of what are their intended use in a market, and then what is their, more, I'd say, sort of exploratory applications, or where is the research going? So when we look at these, technologies that are interfacing, it is highly restricted in what the intended use of that is, and therefore also the consent for patients to be aware of what are the applicable uses of their data that are, not, for example, leaping from something of saying, here we are looking at treating, to go back to the idea of human rights. I deeply believe humans have, the right to apply these tools to their health and wellness, to their autonomy, to their ability to function, their ability to do activities of daily living, like eating and drinking and writing. And that is a very, ultimately a very limited intended use. So I think that when we think about, regulation and the pace of these technologies, we need to maintain those same standards of data privacy. We need to maintain the standards of consent, in fact, arguably enhance consent to keep track with the more sort of living, dynamic nature of some of these newer technologies.
Jared, Jacob, apologies. Jacob, it's just lots of names in the panel. Jacob, we often, we see protections for people's data across the world, right? And we take it, GDPR and other legislations. You can tell it's high on the agenda in terms of what people want from companies that store sensitive data. But this data is so often misused anyways, and there's sort of an expectation that whatever you're putting out there is going to be, is a very high chance that it's going to be used for reasons that you didn't intend. So how, practically speaking, when we say it's important that we know what the specific use for these technologies are, and we make sure that we legislate against them being used otherwise, when we're talking about something which can write to the brain, it seems that that it's like traffic cones against a tank, as it were.
Yeah, that's an interesting metaphor, and I do think that it's hard to make these things completely waterproof, because there are many instances, right, of large corporations doing an oopsie and then taking the hit for that. That happens across many domains, and I think there's a difference here between what are the kind of harms where we go like not even once, and what are the harms where we're like, we try to have less of this in general, but like mistakes do happen. Like those are kind of conceptually different harms. I'm not saying which things fall in which category here, but just that we would take like different approaches to these different things. One kind of edge case that I wanted to throw out here in this like consciousness debate, as we're talking about like which systems do we consider worthy of rights and not, is I understand that there's some experimentation ongoing with seeing if human brain cells can perform machine learning algorithms, basically. So you put human brain cells in a vat and you apply some mild electrical current on them, and you basically see if they learn to do the kind of arithmetic that happens inside AI models, and if they kind of learn some of the same things. Does this like partial human brain in a vat have rights? it's doing thinking in a human brain substrate, but it is not a full human person, of course. And if so, like, what kind of rights should that have? And if that has rights, then like, how different is it from a similar learning algorithm implemented in silicon chips instead of in carbon wetware? I'd be curious to hear how people are thinking about like the edge cases here, so to speak.
Let's bring Susan back in before we have Kat respond as well. Susan, given what you were saying about AI consciousness earlier, it would seem like this brain in a vat does have rights, does it not? Given the fact that it's a subjective experience, given the fact it's able to do some of the things that we're describing there.
It completely depends here on how sophisticated this brain in a vat is. So does it have a self-concept, for example? Does it have high-level intellectual capabilities, or is it just capable of, say, running a flight simulator? I think the animal liberation ethics groups are really going to be helpful on this front, because they consider a range of different non-human animals and ask, at what point do we provide legal protections based on sentience to a class of beings that are very different from us? And these are the kinds of situations we'll find ourselves in. A really challenging situation will be humans that are in a loop and met with artificial intelligence, and it sort of goes back to the group question, because in that case you may have an actual unit deserving of rights that consists of a human as well as an AI, and we don't really have cases within the animal arena that will be as informative as we would like concerning what sort of rights to provide a situation like that.
Kat, should we be looking to the animal rights movement for guidance on whether or not we extend rights to artificial intelligence?
I think we first need to focus on what it means to define who we are. That's the most fundamental thing we can actually do to actually get further into understanding other species. They do have rights, but going back to what we're discussing about neurodata rights, it's still speculative. Why is it speculative? Because we haven't defined who the individual is. We have no idea why this gentleman does this and that person does something else. Once you define that agency, then we're getting closer to defining what it is to be human, and the rights move forward from that, because again, it is speculative. And I would probably add this statement: interpretability over intervention, because we need to have an interpretable layer that helps digest and capture and understand and measure who we are. Because what's happening with the technology nowadays is an afterthought. A lot of these EEG, a lot of these neural signals that are being captured from today's technology is an afterthought. What we need is a structural admissibility beforehand, a structure that allows us to understand the identity, the phenomena, the emergence of the individual. From that, we can go further into divulging in what rights are, because right now we're based on neurorights on what? Generative AI, population summaries of pools that may affect you or may not affect you. And that is very important, because it needs to understand and define who you are for any of us to go any further into developing technologies, not to follow technologies that are trends.
I would like to object to this, actually, because if we're waiting until we have understood consciousness, what an individual are, what we humans truly are, that's going to take a lot of time. I mean, philosophy has been working on these questions for about 2,500 years. Progress has been made. Some of it is even rapid when it comes to consciousness. But I would expect that we're not going to solve this in the next 50 years, perhaps. Maybe it's going to go faster because of it. But in the meantime, the implants are here. The neural data are up on the servers. There are Kickstarters for various brain stimulation devices, and the people are finding all sorts of ways of integrating with that. We are going to need something in the interim.
What we don't want is generative AI data. We need to focus on the individual's data to further enhance who we are, not use generative AI and data pools again to make us subjective of neurorights that may or may not pertain to us, because to create emergence, identity, and phenomena is the key. And what have I told you? The technology exists to compute consciousness.
Are you telling us that?
It is.
I find it half distracting because you got such a brilliant voice, and sometimes it can make me think that you haven't dodged Anders's rebuttal to you, which seemed to be something like Anders was saying before we get on to the ability, consciousness uploading and the like. Anders seemed to be saying that, correct me if I'm wrong, Anders, that we don't need a complete understanding of what it is to be an agent or be conscious in order to give rights to other beings or ourselves, our own species, right? If we know they, for example, experience pain, pleasure, happiness, suffering, or that they have their own ends and projects they want to fulfill, or as Susan was saying earlier, their own concept of self, these seem to be all that we need to know in order to give other species and artificial intelligence and other human beings rights. So we don't need a complete understanding. We just need enough. We need the morally relevant things.
And that's where we're at today. We're doing that today. We're defining that today. But what I'm asking us to do is to extend further from this point, because at this point we'll just be pools of generative AI, suggesting that we'll stick to this. That loses our sovereignty, our agency as a person. And so we can't make rights based on generative AI. We have to get further to the truth of who we are before we lay terms on what it is as humans using technology that captures aftermath.
But you have already laid a pretty strong claim on the individuality and uniqueness here, and you're saying that generative AI doesn't have it. So you seem to be actually having a theory that you believe rather strongly.
Yes, because I think identity is boundaries. Identity needs coherence of biology. Coherence biology is important because that is the aspect of what makes us human, what gives us our experiences. Without those aspects and emergence, how are we defining neurorights without understanding what it means to be human?
Bob, a final word from you before we take questions from the floor. Your response and thoughts on designating rights and the level of understanding we need in order to do so.
What can I say? So I find it fascinating that we can compute consciousness. That's a revelation I didn't understand, and I don't fully understand how we can do that. But the idea that consciousness is just not a cognitive process; it's something that we feel. But as an engineer, I mean, there's nothing there's nothing that we can't manufacture within the laws of physics. Exactly. Right. So we humans live and are manufactured biologically within the laws of physics of this universe. And right. And we as an engineer, I think, I can build that. It might start with silicon, but eventually I'll be using biotech, and I'll build another life form. And if you can compute consciousness, I'll imbue it with that. And now what do we have? Is that a second Genesis?
So we don't have another humanoid. The way we're going towards cyborgs and humanoids if we lose our rights. And so defining who we are, the first steps that structures the platform for understanding who we are, our consciousness, is very vital, because that again tells us the rights that we need to enforce. And this is going back to what I discussed earlier about interpretability layers, to interpret the individual, not the pools of generative AI.
Okay, let's take questions from the floor. Please direct them just at one panelist, and we'll see if we can get a few rebuttals, responses, only if they're particularly excited to do so. Gentleman with the fantastic beard just at the back.
Thank you. So most of you know me. I'm going to blithely ignore the instructions to direct my question to anyone panelists, because this is to everyone who talks about rights. Nobody's actually taken the trouble to define what rights are. You know, and that's actually quite important, because, you know, the intuitive definition is something like, you know, do what you think the entity wants you to do. But how do we know whether we're right about what we think the entity wants to do? You know, this is something that you know, we haven't talked about, and it really, you know, I'm an engineer too, right? So I think of these practical terms, but we have to actually understand what this concept of rights means for how we choose to interact with the entity that we are talking about. So I'd like people's thoughts on that.
Jared.
Yeah, I think the modern conception of human rights are rights to be protected against being treated in ways that we do not want by states and by non-state actors.
But humans are fine, because humans can actually tell us, right? I was referring to entities that may have limited ability, if any, to tell us what they actually want.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, you know, obviously consciousness is one part of a broader understanding of the kind of entity that we would want to see in order to be able to assess whether rights exist, and it's along a continuum. I think for the sake of humanity, we start with human rights, which tragically today, there's an enormous gap between what humans would like and the reality of the world that we live in. And so therefore, I think we spent a lot less time focusing on animals or other creatures. But I mean, there's been a lot of moral philosophy looking at what are the various elements that would collectively come together to then imply that beings have rights against being mistreated in various ways. I'm not obviously capable of talking about all of that right here, right now, but I do think that there is a continuum, and there are a lot of different criteria that have been developed to assess, you know, where along a spectrum an entity might be as to whether it would be deserving of rights or not. I would note that, I mean, we were talking about human rights with humans as being, you know, universal and indivisible, but even when it comes to questions of moral agency, you know, we all know that there are humans who don't have the capability of making decisions for themselves. For example, people with severe disabilities, or a person who is in a coma, for example, and where other people make decisions that are considered to be, according to them, in the best interest of, let's say, a family member. So even there isn't a universal right of all humans to be able to make all decisions for themselves, because there are humans not capable of doing that. So again, this is obviously a very, very complex area.
Anders, can we push the question to you?
Yeah. So I think there is the legal rights, which quite often are motivated by the idea that there is some moral right. And then you can try to motivate the moral rights in very different ways. The United Nations Declaration is kind of fun because it doesn't motivate itself in any way, because they realize there is never going to be a proper agreement. You can try to motivate it by divine command. God gave us certain rights. Some people believe that. Other people say, no, they're natural rights. They're inherent in the world, just like there is charge and gravity. There are certain moral things in reality. That's what Bentham famously said, that's nonsense on stilts. I think you can also make a utilitarian case, a rule utilitarian case, that, okay, we're trying to do what produces the best outcomes in general. That's very complicated, but we can crystallize that into action rules. And some of these action rules glom together very nicely. For example, not killing people works fabulously well for making societies that everybody wants to live in and that actually function well. So you end up with what's not a fundamental right, but something that emerges from a state of affairs, and we can keep on updating and refining. I think that is actually, the rule utilitarian case is what I would say might save us when we get these weird cyborg agents and uplifted animals, organoids, AIs, and collective systems.
Let me just intervene as the resident human rights lawyer here. I will say that there are human rights actually that are enforceable, which are treaties that states out of their own sovereignty decide to sign and sign on to. So for example, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights covers 175, 180 countries in the world today, covering 92% of the world's population. So the challenge in the 21st century is to close the gap between the commitments of states in their own sovereignty deciding to sign and ratify these treaties and their implementation in practice. It isn't a question of defining rights, and it's definitely one step beyond utilitarian approach of, you know, it's in the best interest of humanity to do it because more people would be better off as a result of it. It's because it's actually legally enforceable and binding as a matter of law, because every state on its own has its sovereign right to decide what rules it wants to agree to sign on to. And that's how we have international treaties.
Question from, it's a very cool shirt on the front row. Is that like spaceships and like planets?
Flowers.
Oh, it's flowers.
Jacob, I wanted to direct this question at you because kind of economics related, but also has some philosophy and human rights aspects to it. How will the integration of superintelligence affect economic inequality, and will people from disadvantaged backgrounds suffer disproportionately?
I'll go ahead.
A quick fire. I've been told we need to start wrapping up. I want to take a few quick fire questions if we can.
Right, yeah. So just repeating the question back, will superintelligence, what will it do to economic opportunity and especially for disadvantaged people? So let's first consider, okay, if we have superintelligence or something that's like at least human level in every regard, but it can do the things we can do just much cheaper than we can, what's left for us to do that is economically valuable? Let's assume now that this intelligence is controlled in a way that it doesn't go and take over the world and get rid of humanity, but kind of acts in the ways that we hope for it to do. We still have some things that the AI does not. We have our bodies, which are medical facilities for testing new medicines. So everyone could be lab rats. It's not the most joyful future, perhaps. We have more direct access to our own preferences until you implement the neurotech that lets you that reads your preferences directly. But does that mean that you sit and play like 100 dilemmas every day and that's your job and that's what, like, you produce the data on your preferences for the AI to go out and execute it? It's not the most inspirational future that either. We are more resilient to certain electrical waves, electromagnetic pulses. So if there was a solar flare, someone would be needed to reboot the economy. Maybe we spend all day training to do that just in case. Again, maybe not the most exciting future. So it is a really hard question once you have AI that is at least as capable as humans at everything and can do it more cheaply than us. You basically need, like, before you get to that point, you need some kind of political solution to ensure that humans remain economically relevant, that we remain the main consumers in the economy, even when we're not the main producers. Historically, there's been a quite tight link between the consumers and the producers. And that is a reality that you can say, does it hit everyone? Does it hit just the most disadvantaged? Well, if you don't have enough capital that you can live off capital rents alone, and that is a very small minority, then you're among the disadvantaged ones. So I would say everyone but the top 0.1% or something would be quite disadvantaged in that world.
Okay, we do have just time for one last final question. I've been told we need to wrap up. If it can be directed at Susan, because you can grab any of the other panelists at lunch and they've got opportunities to answer them, whereas Susan obviously will be elsewhere. A question here.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, thanks so much. My name is Kashmir from Graduate Student in Berlin. So on the neurotech side, I'm really concerned about advertising and propaganda. You guys were talking here in this panel about both the readings, the data collection, but also the writing. Is this a valid concern? Does it already manifest? And if it does, how so? And if not, are we close to this, or is this realistic?
Susan, the question is writing onto the brain something that's valid, i.e. is it possible? And if so, how close to it are we? And finally, how big of a risk is that if it was possible and we are close to it?
So this goes into a really interesting arena called cognitive security. And I think that is an arena that's really taking off because already, there's great concern with the information space in general, that with all of the knowledge that science has about how the brain works, that even material on the internet or material we get through close interactions with large language models can write on the brain. Now, fast forward to a time when we have brain augmentations, and I think the risk becomes very grave. So, not only do we have issues involving people who may not be able to opt out of the brain augmentation technology because they're afraid they may not be able to find a job or compete intellectually with other people, but we also have the worry that our bought data is no longer private, and furthermore, that information that we think is our own information and our own independent thought is actually being piped in through our brain augmentation devices. So I think these kinds of scenarios are very real, especially given the history of surveillance capitalism and the way that social media and internet services have played out.
Okay, that's I guess a pessimistic note to end on, but a more optimistic note is that I'm told it's time for lunch. So please join me in thanking all of our panelists and everyone working behind the scenes for making this panel possible. Thank you.